I was delighted to ask Rob to be here tonight because I think there's been a huge gulf in the discussion about teaching and learning. There has been so much emphasis on standards and testing that I really do believe that that sort of wonderful element of teaching that compelled people there in the first place, and that wonderful glimmer in students that gets them to ask why about as soon as their eyes are open, that somehow in the process of civilized schooling, we lose the passion. And I loved the fact that Rob was really keyed into both the passionate teacher and the passionate learner. I think a lot of you in this audience are educators, and I certainly don't need to tell you how difficult it is to go into classrooms these days with daunting circumstances and daunting requirements and daunting memos from people upstairs, and to really try and remember what brought you to teaching in the first place and how you can inspire children, how you can inspire yourself, how you can laugh and be excited about education. And Rob has a very interesting way of writing and looking at things. I remember when they asked that great creative genius who came up with the Avis car rental whole advertising thing, how he was so successful. He said, I tried to look at things as if I were the man from Mars, that I hadn't seen them before, so that I could be really creative. And I think Rob has that capacity to look at things with a fresh eye and to, with humor, point out some of the things we know are wrong, but also to give us guidance through a field which can seem very mind-laden, treacherous, and way down at the bottom of the list, fun. So I'm delighted that Rob is here, and after Rob talks, we'll have Debbie Meier offer us some comments. I have no idea where this woman gets her time, but I do think she probably has a clone someplace. One of the people, kind of waltzes around looking pretty relaxed a lot of the time, and the other person just writes 24 hours a day. I think every time I call up Debbie Meier on the website, there's a new fantastic article or speech that she's given. And for the number of times Debbie has talked about education, it is always original. I don't think she ever gives the same talk twice. She doesn't use the same language twice. And she is really the passionate teacher, never fallen out of love with what she does. So it'll be great to hear her comments, too. Rob, thanks so much for being here, and we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you. I think this is the time I'm supposed to click. Does that make sense? Can you hear me? You could probably hear me without this, right? I think the man from Mars imagery would be one that my children would identify with quite strongly. They often see me in that view, although not necessarily one that they admire, more having to do with how out of touch I am with them. This is a Thursday, and Thursday night is usually the time that I meet with my graduate seminar at Northeastern. We're studying secondary teaching of English and social studies. So when I was invited to speak here tonight, I invited them to come down with me, and we've actually had a bit of a seminar here in this corner while the rest of you were filtering in. But I'm afraid that what happens next, which may look perfectly normal to the rest of you, will come something as a shock to them. You see, they have never before heard me lecture. They're not sure I quite approve of that. And our seminar is very interactive. I'm the facilitator. It's egalitarian. They don't know how much I like to talk. So don't be surprised if you hear some sighs or some groans or stirrings in this side of the room as the illusion I've crafted about myself is shattered, and the facilitative Dr. Hyde of the seminar room, Dr. Jekyll of the seminar room becomes Mr. Hyde of the lectern. I actually thought that we were having this across the street, and so when I thought about beginning this talk, what the image that came into my mind was a very vivid one about the Asquith Lecture Hall from 1971, about 30 years ago, when I was a young doctoral student here at the Edge School. It was a time when I was convinced I knew a lot more than I think I know today. And a new dean had just arrived, a fellow with a strange Norwegian-sounding name, Paul Ylvisåker, who came to us from the Ford Foundation. Dean Ylvisåker was a mild-mannered, rather short, with messy, grizzled gray hair. He looked out at the world through very, very thick glasses. I think he was almost legally blind. We students didn't know much about him, but that to us he looked very close to that species we now refer to as a dead white European male. And in the early 70s was not a time when radical young students, such as we thought ourselves, were about to cut our elders much slack. So we marched into the room and prepared to hear how he was going to acquit himself. And it was not only that we were in the most vicious years then of the Vietnam War. It had been McNamara's war up to then, and it was Nixon's war now. But this was also a time that saw the emergence here on the Harvard campus of a student body that strongly identified along ethnic and gender lines. And we were always on guard against being co-opted by the establishment. So as we wandered into the auditorium to hear our new dean, it was an open question whether this guy could really speak to us in our diverse and radical identities in ways that would earn our respect. Well, Dean Ylvisåker began his remarks by taking note of just this cultural dynamic. He said words something to the effect of, I'm aware that there are many constituencies here in this room, and he began to tick them off one by one. He really began to tick them off. He said, I sense a strong awareness among women on this campus of the radical perspective of women's liberation and the feminist view of the world. Wow, I thought to myself, this guy is jumping right in. But he went on, and there's a large constituency of students here who identify, are very proud of their heritage as African Americans, and who continually remind us of the role of race and racism in our society. Now I began to worry about this guy. His words, if not overtly patronizing, were words that people might say who wanted to co-opt us, who wanted to take our anger and our idealism and turn it into something they could use. There was a definite restlessness in the room, a tensing of the bodies. But the dean, apparently unseeing all this, went right on, he said. And I'm aware of the growing presence of students of Hispanic and Latino culture who are intent upon manifesting their heritage along with the others. I mean, who was this hunky who was come here and presumed to lecture us about our ethnicity and our causes? Whoever he was, he wasn't about to stop. And I know of others here who identify themselves as Native Americans, and on and on. And when Dean Ylvisåker, peering over the lectern in his Coke bottle-bottom glasses, said, but there is one thing I have to say to each of you, I was ready for the worst. I began to look for where the exits were so I could make my escape when the riot broke out. And he let the tension rise until it became almost unbearable. And he said, "My advice to you all is, watch out for the Norwegians." The place exploded in laughter. He had trumped us all. He had caught us in the arrogance, if I may say, of our assumption that only we could talk about ourselves with authenticity. He had reminded us, without saying so directly, that unless we were able also to see ourselves as a community, as a collective, as part of a larger struggle, we would be vulnerable to just this sort of goading, to the kind of trap he had just laid for us. He urged us again, gently, indirectly, not to allow our zest for the advancement of our individual and group identities make us forget that we were also part of the whole, that it would be folly to let our passions, vital though they were to our own sense as educators on our own mission, to let those passions lead us to label one another and isolate each other. I took Paul Ylvisåker's message to heart, even though it led me away from university life for 20 years. As an organizer of learning cooperatives in small New Hampshire towns, I headed a small office of community school partnership in New Hampshire. I was a school board member in Concord, New Hampshire, and an elementary school principal, and then a consultant on school reform working with Ted Sizer's Coalition of Essential Schools, where I met Deborah Meier, among others. But when, in 1994, I returned to the academy as a professor of ed leadership at the University of Hartford, I did so as one who remained deeply interested in the whole picture of education. I was, and am, a generalist. There, I've said it. I've just outed myself as a part of that shunned minority within educational research circles. If the AERA, the American Educational Research Association, for those of you who are unanointed, if they learn that I have come out as a generalist, they will pull my membership, and it will all, if this generalist title becomes affixed to my reputation, it should all but ensure that I will never get tenure anywhere. A generalist recognizes that there is no safe niche for academic scholarship in a world of too many uninteresting schools and too many failing students. That however specialized or exotic one's research interests, they must connect to larger things, to the larger struggle, or risk one's becoming part of the problem. That one's energy must always be divided among the competing interests of teaching, research, and community involvement, each of which has a right to demand our full attention. Now, in my new job, teaching job at Northeastern University, where we too have an ed school, though we don't yet refer to it as the ed school, I remain a generalist, which places me in the company of those whom I consider my mentors: Deborah Meier, Ted Sizer, and Seymour Saracen, all self-confessed generalists. Ted argues as one of his common principles that all educators should be generalists first, teachers of children, and subject specialists second. And it's not that any of my mentors believe that academic disciplines are pedantic or narrow, or that scholars ought not to focus on specific issues or problems. Ted and Deborah are both card-carrying historians, and Seymour is proud to be a psychologist. But all three write of education as part of the commonweal, an enterprise for us all to engage in. a concern that touches each of us as student, parent, worker, citizen. I want to be in their company. That's why I write about passion in teaching and learning, and why I see passion as a quality that belongs potentially to each of us. My problem is to convince my readers that passion is not just something for the few, the bright, the talented, the blessed, the naturals. For me, passionate teachers include all those who ever entered the classroom because they loved kids, because they loved learning, because they wanted in some small way to change the world. Sadly, many who entered with high hopes have not been able to hold onto their passion for very long because of the conditions under which they work. I was talking to someone before who said, we lose our best people in 3 to 5 years. Others nurse their passions quietly, almost embarrassed to care so much or to hold to such high standards in a climate of school and society that looks for compromise and shortcuts. Still others have become embittered by the whole scene. Students who won't do any work, administrators who manipulate, colleagues who complain all the time, officials who won't provide adequate funds, parents who can't seem to be bothered, in a society that would rather blame its schools than fund them. Many disillusioned teachers began their career as passionate people, only to have their spirits dampened, depleted, ground to dust. The passion I talk of belongs as much to them as to the bright-eyed newcomers or the cheeriest veterans. Our nation of children, faced with the ever-changing demands of being citizens of the world, family members, and breadwinners in a 21st century society, cannot afford for any of their teachers' passions to be squelched. I don't claim that all teachers are equally adept at exuding joy of learning for themselves and their students, or that each of us is equally talented in connecting to kids in ways that make our subjects come alive. I know this all too well in my own teaching, where I struggle with the dynamic that Saracen calls power relationships in the classroom. I can't teach well when students feel intimidated by my syllabus, my interactive style, or by the habit of viewing themselves as supplicants whose need to get a good grade can best be pursued by asking, what do you want? So passionate teaching does not come to us, at least not to me, as a birthright. It has to be earned and learned. My books celebrate a few of the tens of thousands of teachers who've learned it well, all of whom I admire. I write in the prelude to the book that passion is not just a personality trait that some people have and others lack, but rather something discoverable, teachable, and reproducible, even when the regularities of school gang up against us. I hope that will prove to be true for me. It has not easy to be an advocate for passionate teaching in a world of high-stakes testing and teach-to-the-test pedagogy. But I'm of the camp that believes that if you are an active, engaged learner yourself, and if you are able to connect your passions in learning and in life with the passions in your students, then great things become possible, even in failing schools and even under deplorable political, social, and organizational conditions. My first book was about the passionate teacher, and my new one is about the passionate learner. I have to say I resisted that title for a long time, in part because passion seemed like a grown-up thing. You know, it's hard to me to identify that with children. But as I thought about it and as I spoke to the parents of preschoolers, I realized that although few kids have the same consistent passions for specific ideas or activities or values as adults do, in the sense that they're always growing and changing and moving from one thing to another. Children do have a continual passion for learning itself. All children, all of them, unless they are neglected or abused, and even some of them are in fact passionate about learning. As Evans Clinchy points out, this is the fundamental fact of our evolution as a species. We have become human precisely because we love to learn. For us, learning is like eating. If we don't do it, we die. Early on in writing The Passionate Learner, I was riding home on the bus, and a very small Asian girl with her adoptive mother, she was about 2 or 3 years old, got on. And the girl began talking in a constant stream of words almost immediately. She said, "Oh, look, Mommy, there are no seatbelts here. This is just like a plane, but there are no seatbelts. How come there are no seatbelts? Aren't we supposed to have seatbelts?" She bounces up and down to demonstrate her freedom and her danger, and then peers out the window. "Oh, we're up so high. The cars look little. Are they little? Or are we big?" There's a pause while she sits down and starts to suck her thumb. Her mother nestles her, inviting her to take a nap, but in a minute she's up again. "Mommy, I'm scared. I'm scared about aliens. I don't want them to get me." She looks to her mom for assistance. Her mom tells her there are no aliens. "But I'm still scared of them. What will they do if they get me?" Patiently, her mother repeats that there are no such things as aliens. "But they may be just out there, and we can't see them. Do you think they know I'm here?" Her eyes twinkle as she says this, as if she knows she's being playful about her fears. She hides beneath her mother's arm, while her mother carefully explains to her why she shouldn't be afraid. "Okay," she says quietly. There's a moment's pause, as though the little girl is trying to decide which is more real, her fantasies or her mother's solace. And then she says, "But what about vampires?" Her mother tries to head this one off, asking a bit sternly, "Now what do we know about vampires?" Soberly, the girl answers in a tone of voice that lets everybody listening, now the whole bus is listening by this time, know that she knows what the right answer is or should be. There are no vampires. They do not exist. That's right, her mother tells her. "I know they don't exist, Mommy. But what do they look like?" Scientist, philosopher, observer of social phenomena, safety engineer, fatalist, the girl astounds us with her vocabulary, her energy, her intellect. Her mother tells me that she was adopted a little over a year ago and that for months she wouldn't say a word. Then one morning she woke up talking and hasn't stopped talking since. This is the promise of the preschool child. And then school. Playgroup to daycare center to preschool to kindergarten. Growth, adventure, relationships, anxiety too. What parent does not face the prospect of school without awe, anxiety, hope, and the foreboding all mixed into a potion that becomes a knot in one's stomach? The problem for children and for teachers comes when these passionate learners arrive in first grade, after the relative freedom of the preschool and kindergarten years, and discover that they must now fit their learning into ways expected of them by what Saracen calls the regularities in the culture of school. This is how one Cambridge mother of a 3-year-old put it. One of the biggest things that I'm hoping for her daughter Sydney in kindergarten, wherever we decide to send her, private or public, is that energy, that enthusiasm that she has now, that they'll be able to understand that and use it as a motivational tool. I mean, I understand that in any school, a child must be appropriate, must be able to conform, to sit down and do what's appropriate. But when you see a child who's just such a spitfire, so full of energy, you wonder that in a year and a half, is she going to have to sit somewhere regimented at a desk for hours and hours? So I want a school for her where her energy won't be squelched, even though I know that it has to be, well, channeled. This time, Sydney is banging on a piano, and I'm sitting there with my tape recorder. Her mom shushes her, and I decide to play the teacher, and so I invite her over, and I say to Sydney, the reason we want you to be quiet is that your mommy is telling me about you. She is saying some very interesting things about you, and I want to be sure that I can hear them. But if you make too much noise, then I won't be able to hear your mommy talking about you. Okay? And Sydney puts her lips to the microphone and says, I want to talk about me. And I want to talk about my dada. And she tells the story and then trots off. And her mother continues. Her mother is a school nurse, and she says, in elementary school, she says, I see children all the time in kindergarten who are like Sydney. You see them running in the morning. They are so excited. They are ready. And then all of a sudden I hear someone shouting at them, you have to line up straight on the line. No talking when you're walking in the corridor. It's order, 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 order. I almost cringe when I hear a teacher speaking that way to the children. Now that may be this one teacher's style, but I think it's indicative of school. When they walk into my nurse's office, these kids almost have become stoics. That fire, that energy is gone. They have to do everything in order. It's so orderly. Deborah Meier has often stated that the reason she became an educational reformer was out of a desire to extend kindergarten up through the grades, at least to the end of high school. And now that she's associated in partnership with us at Northeastern University, we're expecting her to extend kindergarten up through graduate school. You have something to look forward to. It's no small irony that the freedom that children enjoy as preschoolers, it's not until their doctoral study, if then, that they are given the freedom to explore and assert their passions for learning that was their right and daily joy as a preschooler. I constantly run into this in my teaching. College students whose sense of themselves as learners has for so many years transmuted into a preoccupation with figuring out what their teachers want, and that such behavior seems to them identical with learning. None of my students that are here fit into that category, but there are others. Of course, in many cases, it would be a good thing for our students to want what we want of them. Depth of inquiry, intellectual skepticism, critical imagination, creative approaches to a problem, or close attention to the craft of writing well. But too often, we get not these things we want, but a much more submissive effort to psych us out, to read our minds, to anticipate our biases. The irony is that such docility robs student work of just those qualities we do seek. It's lose-lose. We educators need to be passionate generalists so that we can help our students break out of that cycle. What I'd like in the rest of the time to invite to you to explore with me 3 new areas of inquiry that have come out of my work and that are still very speculative and unproven. I hope, in fact, that some of you tonight may want to take a look at them from the perspective of your own experiences. And I've given a couple of sort of brief cryptical handouts to some of you to begin to connect with us. But don't read them now. Just they'll be part of what goes up on the overheads. But let me tell you what these 3 areas are. The first is that we teachers regularly, if unknowingly, undermine and sabotage our deepest goals for student learning. By the traditional grading practices we employ, we do it to ourselves. The second speculative area is that in this furious curriculum debate that's going on all around us, with the advocates of more content fighting against the advocates of better relationships, I want to look at the question of how we pay more attention to how we relate to content, to how kids and teachers relate to content. And I'll show you a little more about that. And then finally, the third area of speculation that I want to invite your participation in is that in the effort to promote literacy in children, and amid official practices that define children in terms of their deficiencies, we overlook the need for willing engagement by children from all backgrounds in reading, writing, and speaking. Any one of these topics could take a whole day or a weekend, let alone parts of an hour. So what you're going to get is some very brief, very preliminary, very speculative, quasi-research into this area. Let's look first at how teachers, particularly in the middle schools and beyond, regularly sabotage their own goals. Let's see. This is an exercise that I conduct with teachers all over the... Is this better or better? Is this on or off? Is it on now? It's neither. Now it's on? Okay. All right. I trust you. I get a group of teachers together, and I ask them to pick a course that they like, something they like to teach. And I ask them to pick 5 goals that represent for them the kind of learning they want to stay with their students after the course is over, after they've forgotten the details. Please limit it to 5, I ask them. The things that you want your kids to be working on, synthesizing, applying. And then I say list all 5 and give each a rough percentage so that they add up to 100, and then represent them on a pie chart. And I do, and if I don't have much time, I give them an example of such a pie chart. In a contemporary world literature course, we want them to, I might say that I would be teaching, I want them to read more on their own, to remain interested in other cultures, to appreciate the writer's approach, to write about fiction in relation to your life, to know the structure of fiction. You may have different ones, add to them, change them, but you know, if I have inculcated and inspired students to do this, I feel pretty good, and I call that the passionate teacher in you. So I'm ready to anoint everybody in the workshop at this stage as a passionate teacher because they all are able to do this. And then I ask them to put that aside and on a similar pie chart, just tell me how they grade this course. How much do they give for homework? How much do they give for participation? How much of the grade is based on quizzes or independent study projects or field work or whatever? And again, to place each of those so that they add up to 100, and each of those so that they fit somewhere on the pie chart. And then, depending on the nature of my relationship with them, I again look for where the exit is. I put my tests up. This is another example. And then I put them both together. I ask them, in fact, to put them side by side. And I say, if you were to give what do you notice when you put these two things side by side? And I ask, if you offered both of them to your students on the first day of school and said they could keep one of them and take them home with them, which one would they take with them? And then I say, if you told them they could have both of them, which one would they leave behind anyway? And this is when I start to get some pretty upset responses. This exercise often gets me in trouble with my audience. They think that they've been tricked, and in a sense, they're right. I have tricked them into revealing on paper the fundamental contradictions between the quality goals they seek as educators, what's in their heart, the passionate teacher that is in there, and what they have been led to believe it takes to get their students to do the work. So that's the first series of speculative questions. How can we avoid the unconscious undermining and sabotage of our most deep goals for student learning in our acceptance of the regularities of grading that appear to be part of the atmosphere, to come with the territory, to be part of what our jobs is as professionals. The next area I want to look at is this question of relationships, curriculum as relationships. But not just relationships between students and teachers and students and teachers and parents. Those are very important, and I talk about those as well. But the relationships of the student to the material or the task. And here is the speculative part. I believe this should be an open conversation. I believe this should be a conversation that we undertake with our students. And I have pretended that this is a conversation that's somewhere around the middle school grades. So I've created my own chart here from 0 to 4, various stages of how kids relate to the curriculum, from anger and hostility to indifference to mild interest, etc., to love of learning. And I would invite teachers to ask their kids about their subject in the midst of their subject, or at the beginning of their subject, or when they've gotten their feet wet in the subject a little, to anonymously identify how many of you are at the 0 level, the 1 level, the 2 level, but anonymously, so that they do it on little pieces of paper and give it to some kid in the back of the room to collate and announce the results. I also, and these are not necessarily to be used together, but they could be, I've given some indication of what might be going in through a 7th or 8th or 6th or 7th or 8th grader's mind as she or he thinks about the subject matter. I'll let you read that for yourself. And the part I'm interested in is having the conversation. Is having the conversation in which the teacher essentially says, I acknowledge where you begin in this subject. It's not where I want to see you end, but I acknowledge that this is where we are. We have some who are kind of interested and willing to do what I want to do. We have some, 1 or 2 who really love this, and some who really resent what we're doing here. I don't need to know who you are. Let's just acknowledge that that's where we are. Now, how do we move up this chart? What do we need to do together so that the content becomes, of this task, the challenge of this problem, becomes more meaningful to you, more valuable to you, so that you see yourself moving up or down, depending on which side of the diagram you're looking at. And I would do that again also with teachers. I would ask us to do this in our departments or in the sanctity of our own home, because teachers' relationship to content is also extremely important, as we all know, and how it affects children. So the teacher who comes in and slams the book on the table of the teacher's lounge and say, "Boy, I managed to bore even myself today," as opposed to the teacher who is passionate about their role. And again, this is not to label us, it's to acknowledge where we start. That in this thing I'm being asked to cover, this piece of the curriculum I'm asked to do, I'm no more than a 2 or a 1. It's my professional responsibility to teach these effectively. It'll be on the test. Let's get on with it. As opposed to, I love this stuff and will do whatever I can to share my excitement with my students. What you have on the blue sheet, no, the green sheet, is all of those graphs, all of those Likert scales. And again, I welcome your looking at those and seeing how you might want to use that, not to judge people, but to acknowledge where they are and dialogue with them about moving up. And I think the key to all of this is caring. The true challenge for any teacher is to make caring the threshold for student work in any subject where thoughtfulness, imagination, analysis, reflection are important aspects of knowledge and skills. When teachers focus solely on performance or compliance, has the student completed the assignment? Is it up to par? We get the typical range of responses that we just saw on the other chart. But if we ask, does the student care about what she's doing, we open the door, I believe, to a more engaging dialogue, leading, we hope, to more productive teaching-learning relationships. But as I said, this is not a truth, this is a speculation. And I'm going to have to depend on other people to follow that out with me. And I would, again, very much welcome your doing that. I'll be very brief about the last one because I think we're running out of time. A student is working with me on an undergraduate research project around this question of willing literacy. And after a lot of input from undergraduate students at Northeastern who are focused on literacy and community projects, we've come up with this, which is, we started with something like the last, a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 5, and our undergraduate students said, If they see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they'll know you want us to be a 5. So we decided to take the numbers out, mix them up, turn them into different colors, and what we hope to do is to go around to some 5th or 6th grade classes where the teacher is interested in promoting the voluntary part of student literacy, the emphasis on the reading that they do on their own when they don't have to, and hand a batch of these colors around to kids and say, which color are you? And they would decide which color they are. And if they didn't like the way it said, they could change it. They could say, this is, I'm a tan, and but I do a little more than that. In other words, we don't want to put our words in their mouths. We want to give them a way of identifying themselves as some kind of a reader, of a voluntary reader. I don't know what happens at that point, whether they go up on a bulletin board to see how many collections of which kind of colors there are in this class, whether the kids decide to put their names on them. But here we have the beginning of a conversation between and among students and teacher, a conversation that doesn't take the place of a formal literacy instructional program, but that supplements it with that added dimension of willing engagement. It says, we are very interested in the reading you do that nobody makes you do. And we want to find out what, if anything, what kind of reader you want to be and what we can possibly do here to support that. Anything from having a bookshelf there that books can only be put on there by students in the classroom, books they've read that they think other kids might like. No adult gets to put anything on that shelf. That's the outside reading, books I love, magazines I love type of shelf. So, I want to just close by asking, what can teachers and parents do to help learning remain a worthwhile, sometimes joyous, often tedious and rigorous, but ultimately successful and rewarding undertaking for all students? How can the young child's delight with discovering her world remain a moving force in her formal education? Children need time and space and materials and loving guidance from adults to pursue the joys of learning in an atmosphere where their creative pressures come from within, free from prejudice or mockery or the intellectual and emotional disfigurement of labels. They require of us that we make in our schools a safe place for the mind and the spirit to grow, a child, a teenager, where each individual's efforts are joined in the execution of a task, a project, a performance by the work of classmates and mentors in school, at home, and in the community, where they can count on finding enough adults who are around them and who will help them to become powerful. Children come to us as passionate learners. It's our charge to help them develop the disposition to sustain over a lifetime an openness to things worth knowing. Thank you.
Once a week, Rob actually comes to my house and we argue. Now, I haven't decided whether we disagree a great deal or we both enjoy arguments so much. But he usually often brings or leaves behind an article which he tells me is great, which I'm absolutely convinced he knows I will detest. I'm intrigued when I listen to him because I think that part of our style sometimes gets in the way of our good teaching, and Rob has worked harder than I have, I think, sometimes at keeping it under control. Because although I think it's got an important place in teaching as well, and I want to talk a little about that. I had all kinds of thoughts as I was listening to him. We really got to, we knew each other earlier, but we got friends when he sent me the manuscript of The Passionate Teacher. And what year was that?
94 must have been.
So it was before I came up to Boston. But I do remember that I immediately wanted to show it to there were chapters I wanted to, because I always believe that the truth shall set us free, that if I could only find it written exactly the right way, it will transform the world. And there were chapters it was an earlier version of this, but there were chapters in it that I wanted immediately to bring to school. And I knew which teacher I wanted to read this and which this, and it was usually with the converter's instinct in me. And so I pushed very hard to get the book published because I knew I was slightly more likely to be able to get teachers to read it if it was published than if I ran it off on the copy machine and stuffed all their boxes with this. And those who ever worked for me in a school know I'm always stuffing boxes with my latest the latest passion in my mind. in any case, it did get it, and some teachers really it mattered too. It always is disappointing to me that every book that I fall in love with is not popular with everybody else. And but that is at heart why I find the current standardization movement so discouraging. It's hard for me to understand in some ways people who haven't already discovered by the time they've grown up that their truths are not everybody's, their passions are not everybody else's, that their favorite movie is the world's worst movie to somebody else's viewpoint, and that it is very hard, even to decide that this is an okay book. That is, that there are books that have been all those wonderful rejection notices we've all heard about from great authors, that they sent it to a publisher who said this is a bunch of nonsense, I wouldn't conceive of publishing this, it's time you learn how to write, and later it turns out to be one of the world's great novels. I don't have a list of them here. Victor Navasky once published an article with rejection notices, and then a little code at the bottom telling us who had deserved them, and they were all the world's great writers of the last 100 years. In any case, he has, for the last 6 years, Rob, regaled me with his latest passion, and almost by instinct I have argued with him. And out of those arguments, I think we have, both of us, become better teachers. But we have also had to learn that that wasn't necessarily the best way to conduct the education of the students in our, and partly for the reason that Rob raised, and I want to talk about that for a moment, because we came to each other as people of equal power. I had no power over him, and he had no power over me. And even if you love arguing, the argument between people who have not got equal power is very different in its impact, its meaning, its potential, than the argument between people of similar power. And it is the issue that I struggle with in schools, because to create a school that has the quality of equal power has within it some contradictions and dilemmas that sometimes I think Rob forgets when he writes, but which I think on the whole he struggles with in his own domain in the graduate level that I struggle with in school. I just came from a meeting lasting 2 hours in which in our school we decided staffing, some very difficult staffing issues. We had it takes a year and a half in our school for a teacher to become, so to speak, a tenured member of our pilot school faculty. And at the end of the first half year, and a half a year to be, at this time of the year, we decide who to invite back for next year of the non-tenured faculty. And we had 4 such people, 2 people whom we invited back this year and had to make a decision about whether we wanted them to become part of our tenured faculty, and 2 people who came to us this year, and we had to decide whether we were going to invite them back next year. And my own struggle to make sure that I used my expertise, because after all, I have a great deal more expertise in many ways than my fellow teachers. I have 30 years of being a principal. I have seen a great deal about what it is to make a great teacher. I have some strong views about the way we need to go about helping our colleagues. I have some strong views about what qualities I see in someone that convinces me they will be a great teacher. On the other hand, I have promised that this is a school, a staff-governed school, and all our voices will in the end count equally. And it is a complicated process for me and for them over the 5 years we've been running this school together to get to the point we were today, in which I felt freer than I ever had before to say what I thought and feel that it was taken seriously. It was acknowledged seriously, but so was every other voice in that room. taken equally seriously, and the vote was a genuine one then when we came to it. And that is a similar struggle we have in classrooms, because we're not all the equal of every 6-year-old. So it is pretensions to say that 6-year-olds should have equal power to me in the room, except in the sense that we can reach a point, which is, I think, what Robbie was struggling with in these exercises, in which we can dialogue as equals, even though we come to these with very different levels of expertise, competence, and authority. And I'm just saying that I think that's the hardest thing for us in our classrooms and our teaching, and it's the thing that makes this issue of being a passionate teacher complicated, because if you are the person of power, your passions can overwhelm people, they can intimidate people, they can infuriate people, even as you intend them to liberate and excite them. And I have not yet found the answer to that question, and I really do hope maybe that we can talk briefly here today about how this is experienced in your lives and in your experience and from your history, because I think it's a central question for our kind of teaching. And there are all kinds of other things I feel passionate about today that have nothing directly to do with this, such as my passionate feelings about what's happening in the world we live in, and what I passionately feel is not happening for our children today, because I actually also feel we have never been in greater danger of raising kids in passion-impoverished environments. And if you think kindergarten, that I want to keep kindergarten alive, you're now wrong. I don't want to keep kindergartens alive till 12th grade, because I think the kindergartens in American schools have become impoverished places, and most pre-kindergartens. And I think a great many families, out of the best of intentions for their children, allow them to spend 10, 12 hours a day engaged in activities that cannot possibly reach their hearts and minds. And I have parents who come to me also in the greatest enthusiasm, who want us to give their children 5, 6 hours of homework at night, because they either don't trust themselves to share their own passions, or believe that they no longer have authority in relation to their children, and therefore their children won't do anything if I don't tell them that they must do it, and who can imagine that there is any activity that I could dictate from the school that could possibly truly engage their children for 1, 2, 3, 4 hours at home, that they also weren't involved in, engaged in. And when I say to them, listen, the word homework just means 2 words. It means work done at home. And you're the one at home and invent interesting work. And that seems either intimidating to parents, or they feel that's not what they ought to be doing. So I'm worried not only about schools that are taking away children's passion, but I am more passionate today than I've ever been about a larger social setting, which can't stand. I used to think, well, all right, schools are like that, but then I got the rest of the children's lives. They can go out and imagine and play and invent. But I see more and more kids who go from schools to daycares that are even more oppressive than schools, and then go home to exhausted families who believe, for one reason or another, that more of the same is what is their duty to do at home. And so I think the challenge for us about passionate teaching and passionate learning is a broad social challenge. And I want to thank Robbie for having put that word up there for us. Now you talk.